Imagine a kingdom teetering on the brink of oblivion. For nearly a century, France had bled, its fields scarred, its villages plundered, its spirit fractured by the relentless 100 Years' War. Its rightful heir, Charles, a king in name only, huddled in dispirited exile, his claim to the throne overshadowed by English might and internal strife. Hope was a distant whisper, drowned out by the cries of a suffering populace. Then, from the unlikeliest of places, a flicker of defiance ignited. A simple peasant girl, barely a woman, claimed to hear divine voices. The Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine, compelling her to undertake an impossible mission, to save her nation. This is the astonishing, almost unbelievable tale of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. Join us as we journey into 15th century France, exploring the brutal realities of war and the extraordinary power of a single, unwavering belief. We will witness Joan's improbable rise from the obscurity of a tiny village to become a formidable military leader, inspiring an army and changing the course of a seemingly endless conflict. From her miraculous victories on the battlefield to the chilling betrayal that led to her tragic end, we uncover how one uneducated girl, guided by visions, forged the very identity of France and left an indelible mark on history. Prepare to delve into the legend, the truth, and the enduring legacy of a girl who dared to challenge fate. The year is 1429. For nearly a century, France has been a ravaged land, a fractured kingdom bleeding under the relentless scourge of the 100 Years' War. It is a conflict that has torn apart the very fabric of society, leaving a trail of desolation and despair from the sun-drenched fields of Gascony to the rain-swept plains of Picardy. Villages lie in ruin, crops are burned, and the once proud cities are scarred by siege and famine. The people, battered by endless skirmishes and brutal foreign occupation, stare into an abyss of hopelessness. Since the catastrophic defeat at Agincourt in 1415 and the subsequent Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which disinherited the rightful French Dauphin, Charles VII, and declared the English King Henry V heir to the French throne, France has been carved into pieces. The English, allied with the powerful Burgundians, control vast swathes of the north, including Paris itself. The Dauphin, a man of indecisive character and meager resources, clings precariously to the southern territories, a king without a crown, holed up in his chateaux along the Loire. His legitimacy is openly questioned, his court riddled with infighting and pessimism. The nation's spirit is broken, its faith in its leaders, its very future, all but extinguished. The once glorious Cape Tian legacy, the very idea of a unified France, seems on the verge of vanishing forever into the dust of history. Children born into this age of perpetual conflict knew no peace, only the ever-present shadow of war, the brutal realities of occupation, and the gnawing fear of starvation. The French people, weary beyond measure, cried out for salvation, for miracle. They yearned for a sign, a leader, a deliverance from the endless suffering that had become their daily bread. The stage was set for the impossible, for an intervention so extraordinary it would defy all reason and reshape the destiny of a nation on the brink of absolute collapse. Yet, even in the deepest shadows of despair, a faint light flickered in the collective consciousness of the French people. Amidst the ashes of ruined homes and the silence of fallen towns, whispers persisted. Ancient prophecies, passed down through generations, stories clinging to life like stubborn weeds in a desolate field. For centuries, French folklore had been rich with tales of divine intervention, of saints and miracles, especially in times of profound crisis. The people, deeply pious and superstitious, sought solace and meaning in these old narratives. One prophecy, in particular, resonated with haunting clarity. The prediction that France, having been lost by a woman, would be saved by a virgin from the marches of Lorraine. It was a prophecy attributed to figures as diverse as Marie Robin of Avignon and the revered Merlin, It spread through market squares, across hearths in peasant cottages, and even into the more superstitious corners of the royal court. The woman who lost France was widely understood to be Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of the Mad King Charles VI, whose controversial actions and the Treaty of Troyes had effectively disinherited her son and handed the kingdom to the English. This prophecy offered a glimmer of hope, a powerful narrative framework through which the suffering masses could interpret their predicament. It wasn't merely a fanciful tale. It was a deeply ingrained cultural expectation, a belief that laid fertile ground for the miraculous. The idea of a Maid, untouched by the worldly corruption and political machinations that had failed France, appearing from the humble, contested borderlands of Lorraine, became a powerful symbol. It suggested that salvation would not come from the discredited nobility, but from an unexpected, pure source. As the years wore on, and the situation grew ever more dire, these whispers grew louder, morphing from ancient lore into a desperate, tangible anticipation, a yearning for the prophesied deliverer to finally appear. The stage was thus not only set for a savior, but for a very specific kind of savior, one perfectly aligned with the hopes and fears of a broken nation. It was into this world of profound despair and burgeoning prophecy that a remarkable figure would emerge, not from the halls of power, but from the humble, contested lands of Lorraine. Our story turns now to Domremy, a small, unremarkable village situated on the very cusp of French and Burgundian territories. In a time when borders were fluid and loyalties shifting, Domremy lay precariously balanced between the two warring factions, a constant reminder of the wider conflict. Here, in 1412, a girl named Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, as history would remember her, was born. Joan's upbringing was that of a typical peasant girl of the era. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a respectable farmer, a dyer, and a minor official in the village, holding the position of doyen responsible for local collection of taxes and organizing village watch. Her mother, Isabelle Romy, instilled in Joan a deep and abiding piety, teaching her prayers and the tenets of the Catholic faith. Joan learned the domestic skills expected of a girl: spinning, sewing, and helping with the animals. She knew the rhythm of the seasons, the feel of the soil, the simple joys and hardships of rural life. She was unlettered, like most of her peers, but she possessed an uncommon devotion and a profound empathy for the suffering she witnessed around her. Domremy itself was a microcosm of France's plight. Though primarily loyal to the Dauphin, it was regularly threatened by Burgundian raids. Joan and her family lived with the constant drumbeat of distant skirmishes, the fear of marauding soldiers, and the sight of displaced refugees. These formative years, marked by both idyllic simplicity and the looming shadow of war, instilled in Joan a deep sense of justice and an unwavering faith in divine providence. She was a child of the borderlands, shaped by both peace and conflict, grounded in the realities of her impoverished nation, yet possessed of a spirit that would soon soar far beyond the confines of her small village. This ordinary girl, from this ordinary place, was about to embark on an extraordinary journey, one that would defy all expectations. Life in Domremy was simple, predictable, until one pivotal summer afternoon when everything changed irrevocably for young Joan. She was 13 years old, and like any other day, she was alone in her father's garden. But this day, the air thrummed with an unusual energy, a light not of this world enveloped her, and then a voice. It was clear, distinct, and it spoke directly to her soul. This was not a dream, not a fleeting thought, but a profound, undeniable communion with the divine. Her first vision, as she would later describe, was of Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior saint, surrounded by a choir of angels. He told her to be a good girl, to go to church often, and assured her that God would help France. Initially, Joan was overwhelmed, frightened even, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. But the voices returned, growing stronger, more frequent, and more specific. Soon, St. Michael was joined by two female saints, St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Margaret of Antioch. These revered martyrs, figures of immense courage and unwavering faith, became her constant companions, her celestial counselors. For 4 long years, from the age of 13 to 17, Joan kept these sacred experiences largely to herself, wrestling with their meaning, internalizing their messages. The voices were not fleeting whispers. They were vivid, tangible encounters, often accompanied by brilliant light and a profound sense of presence. They guided her, comforted her, and slowly, unmistakably, began to lay out a divine mission. They taught her patience, courage, and obedience to God's will. She learned to distinguish them, to trust their counsel above all earthly doubts. This quiet, deeply religious peasant girl was being groomed for a destiny beyond anything she could have imagined, a unique purpose revealed by the very saints of heaven. These weren't mere imaginings. For Joan, they were the absolute truth, the beginning of her unique and improbable journey to save a broken kingdom. What began as general spiritual guidance in a quiet garden soon evolved into a clear, urgent, and monumental divine mandate. Over the years, the messages from St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret coalesced into an impossible command. Joan, an uneducated peasant girl, was chosen by God to save France. Her mission was twofold, but inextricably linked to the very survival of the kingdom. She was to raise the brutal siege of Orleans, and she was to lead the dispossessed Dauphin, Charles VII, to Reims for his rightful coronation. The voices left no room for doubt. They were not suggestions. They were absolute commands, filled with a divine authority that Joan dared not question. They told her she must put aside her simple life, don the armor of a warrior, and confront the might of the English armies that had brought France to its knees. She was to accomplish what the greatest generals and the most cunning diplomats of her age had failed to do. To a young woman who had never ridden in battle, never held a sword in anger, the task seemed utterly, laughably impossible. Orleans, a strategic stronghold on the Loire, had been under siege for months, its fall imminent and widely believed to signal the complete collapse of French resistance. And Reims, the ancient city of coronations, lay deep in English Burgundian territory, a seemingly insurmountable distance for a king without an army. But Joan's faith in her voices was unshakable. They assured her that God was with her, that she would be given the strength and the means to fulfill her sacred duty. The weight of a dying nation rested on her slender shoulders, a destiny forged in divine instruction and profound personal conviction. This was no longer just about her. It was about the very soul of France. Her mission was clear: restore the rightful king, expel the invaders, and bring God's peace back to her suffering homeland. The world might laugh, but Joan knew, with an absolute certainty born of divine communion, that she was merely an instrument in God's grand design. Armed with a divine mandate that transcended all earthly logic, Joan understood that her first, most daunting challenge would not be on the battlefield, but in convincing others to believe her. How could a simple, unlettered peasant girl, barely out of childhood, persuade powerful men to entrust her with the fate of a kingdom? Her voices had given her specific instructions. She must go to Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the royal garrison at Vaucouleurs, and demand an escort to the Dauphin at Chinon. This was a man of stern reputation, a hardened soldier, and a pragmatist. Her family, understandably, was horrified. Her father, Jacques, fearing scandal or worse, even spoke of drowning her rather than seeing her join soldiers. Her local priest, Father Front, initially listened with skepticism, attempting to dissuade her, suggesting her visions might be demonic rather than divine. But Joan's conviction was absolute. She stood firm, unwavering, her simple yet profound faith a rock against the tide of doubt. She persisted, her sincerity and unwavering resolve slowly beginning to wear down the initial resistance. With the help of her uncle, Durand Lassois, she made her way to Vaucouleurs, a fortified town not far from Domremy, and presented herself to Baudricourt. Her initial reception was dismissive, if not contemptuous. A common girl claiming divine instruction to save France? It was preposterous, an insult to his intelligence, a clear sign of madness. He sent her away, reportedly telling her uncle to slap her and take her back to her father. Yet, Joan refused to be dismissed. She returned again and again, her quiet persistence and profound certainty a relentless force against the walls of cynicism. Each rejection only strengthened her resolve, for her voices had assured her she would reach the Dauphin. Her journey, steeped in faith, had begun with the most difficult of battles, winning the hearts and minds of those closest to her, a testament to her extraordinary will. Joan's extraordinary perseverance at Vaucouleurs began to chip away at the hardened cynicism of Robert de Baudricourt. She would return to his stronghold repeatedly, her plea simple yet profound. God had sent her to save France. Initially, he laughed, scorned, and dismissed her, finding her claims utterly unbelievable. But Joan's presence was unsettling. Her conviction was palpable, her eyes burning with an unshakable faith that few men possessed. Her words, though spoken by a simple girl, carried an unusual authority. One pivotal moment is said to have occurred when Joan, despite having no earthly way of knowing, correctly announced a French military defeat at the Battle of the Herrings near Orleans, days before official news reached Vaucouleurs. Whether a coincidence or a testament to her divine insight, this event, coupled with her unwavering calm and consistent message, began to sway Baudricourt and those around him. The pragmatic captain, surrounded by the desperation of a failing war, started to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, this maid was indeed touched by something beyond his understanding. Eventually, Baudricourt decided to test her. He allowed her to meet with a local holy man, who, after scrutinizing Joan, confirmed her sincerity. He witnessed her capacity to inspire, her incredible certainty that God was on her side. The political climate, too, played a role. France was in such dire straits that any glimmer of hope, however unconventional, was worth grasping. At last, after months of relentless petitioning, Baudricourt yielded. He agreed to provide Joan with an escort to Chinon, to present herself to the Dauphin. He dressed her in male attire, for safety and practicality on the dangerous journey, and provided her with a sword. It was a monumental shift, a crossing of a threshold. From the gates of Vaucouleurs, a peasant girl, now clad as a soldier, would embark on a perilous 11-day journey through enemy territory, carrying the weight of a nation's destiny on her young shoulders, heading towards a rendezvous with a king and a prophecy. Joan's breakthrough at Vaucouleurs was more than just a triumph of personal conviction. It was a profound confirmation of ancient prophecies that had sustained the French people through their darkest hours. As news of her miraculous claims and her impending journey spread, the whispers of a maid from Lorraine, saving France, erupted into a murmur of excited anticipation. Her appearance, her unwavering certainty, and even her humble origins from the contested borderlands, fit the legendary predictions with uncanny precision. This wasn't merely a coincidence. It was a psychological turning point for a desperate nation. The belief in prophecy provided a crucial framework through which the seemingly impossible could be understood and accepted. For a people weary of political failures and military defeats, Joan's arrival offered not just a new leader, but a divine validation, a sign from God himself that France had not been abandoned. It instilled a powerful, almost spiritual hope that transcended the brutal realities of war. The very fact that she was a maid, pure, uncorrupted, and guided by heaven, became a potent symbol. She was untainted by the political maneuvering, the dynastic squabbles, and the military blunders that had brought France to its knees. She represented a clean slate, a pure instrument of God's will, offering a fresh start. As Joan and her small escort journeyed toward Chinon, word of the Maid preceded them, igniting the imaginations of the populace. Peasants and soldiers alike whispered of the prophecy being fulfilled finding renewed courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story wasn't just a tale of a girl. It was a testament to the enduring power of faith, a beacon of light in an age of encroaching darkness. Joan of Arc was not just a person. She was becoming a living embodiment of France's deepest hopes and its ancient promises, an unmistakable sign that salvation, against all earthly logic, might finally be at hand. The stage was now set, not just for a meeting with a king, but for a nation to witness the unfolding of a destiny foretold centuries ago. In the winter of 1429, with the fate of France hanging by a thread, an uneducated peasant girl, barely a teenager, embarked on a journey that would defy all logic. This was Joan of Arc, and her destination was Chinon, where the dispossessed Dauphin Charles VII awaited, if he believed her at all. The road from Vaucouleurs, the small fortress town where she had finally convinced the local lord, Robert de Baudricourt, to grant her an escort, stretched over hundreds of miles, a treacherous gauntlet through territory crawling with English patrols and Burgundian brigands, hostile to the very idea of a French resurgence. Joan chose to travel disguised as a man, her hair shorn, clad in practical men's hose and a tunic, a disguise that offered a modicum of protection but could also condemn her to death if her true identity were discovered. Her small band of escorts, a handful of loyal men-at-arms, knew the immense risks. Each rustle in the dense, frost-bitten forests, each distant cry carried on the biting wind, was a potential ambush. They rode mostly by night, guided by the cold, pale moonlight, or traversed lesser-known paths, skirting villages and towns where enemy garrisons might lie in wait. This was no ordinary trek. For Joan, it was a pilgrimage, a test of faith and an act of unfathomable courage. She wasn't fleeing danger. She was riding into it, propelled by an inner conviction that burned brighter than any torch they carried. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, none of it deterred her. She rode for 11 days, her resolve unwavering, her focus singular, to reach Charles, to deliver her divine message, and to save France. The very act of this journey, undertaken by a young woman in an age of brutal warfare and social strictures, speaks volumes about her extraordinary spirit. It was a perilous ride, fraught with mortal danger, but for Joan, it was the first necessary step on a path ordained by God, a path that would lead her from obscurity to the crucible of destiny. After enduring the trials of the road, Joan finally arrived at Chinon, a formidable medieval castle perched majestically above the Vienne River. But here, the physical dangers of the journey gave way to a different, perhaps even more daunting, challenge: the entrenched. Cynicism of the French court and the profound skepticism of the Dauphin himself, Charles VII. Chinon in 1429 was not a place of grandeur and confidence. It was a court in disarray, its inhabitants weary from decades of war, betrayal, and relentless defeat. The halls, though once magnificent, now echoed with a quiet desperation, their tapestries faded, their fires offering little warmth against the chill of impending doom. Courtiers, bedecked in their finery, whispered behind cupped hands, their faces etched with suspicion and weariness. They had seen charlatans and false prophets before, each promising salvation, each delivering only further disappointment. Into this atmosphere of jaded despair walked Joan, a simple peasant girl from Domremy, still in her travel-worn men's clothes. Her rustic appearance stood in stark contrast to the opulence, however faded, of the court. Dauphin Charles, a man marked by a lifetime of setbacks, was notoriously indecisive and wary. He had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, mocked as the King of Bourges, and watched his kingdom shrink to a shadow of its former glory. The idea that a teenage girl, claiming divine visions, could turn the tide of a war that had crippled generations of hardened warriors seemed, to him, preposterous, even insulting. Charles had every reason to be cautious. To embrace a mystic peasant could be seen as an act of desperation, a sign of weakness to his enemies, and a potential political disaster if her claims proved false. He kept his distance, observed, and deliberated. The initial meeting between the Maid of Orleans and the future King of France was not one of immediate acceptance, but rather one steeped in suspicion, doubt, and the heavy burden of a kingdom teetering on the brink. The initial encounter between Joan and the Dauphin was meticulously orchestrated by Charles, a test designed to expose a fraud. He had disguised himself, blending into a throng of courtiers, allowing another man to pose as him, seated on the throne. It was a clever ruse, intended to trap an impostor relying on simple recognition. But Joan, guided by her voices, was not to be fooled. As she entered the great hall, her gaze cut through the assembled crowd, past the false Dauphin, and settled with unwavering certainty on Charles VII. She walked directly to him, knelt and declared, "God give you good life, noble Dauphin." This act alone was astounding, defying all reasonable explanation. But what followed was even more miraculous, a moment that would forever alter the course of French history. Joan then drew Charles aside for a private conversation, the details of which remain cloaked in legend and the solemn secrecy of the confessional. What transpired, however, was reported to be deeply personal and profoundly convincing. Joan revealed to Charles the contents of a secret prayer he had made, alone in his private chapel just days before. In his desperation, Charles had silently begged God for a sign, for reassurance that he was indeed the rightful king of France, and that he would be granted the means to reclaim his kingdom, or, failing that, to be spared a humiliating death. Joan, with no conceivable human way of knowing this intimate plea, laid bare his soul. She described his prayer with such precision, even repeating his exact words, that Charles was utterly stunned. This was not a guess. This was not trickery. This was irrefutable proof, a direct line to the divine. The Dauphin, a man drowning in doubt, had been given the sign he craved. In that moment, the skepticism that had hardened his heart began to crack, replaced by a dawning belief. Joan was not merely a peasant girl with a story. She was a messenger of God, and her mission, unequivocally, was divinely inspired. The future of France, and indeed, Joan's own destiny, were irrevocably sealed by this secret, powerful revelation. Even after the miraculous revelation at Chinon, Charles VII, ever cautious, was not yet ready to fully commit to Joan. To grant a young peasant girl, especially one claiming divine guidance, command over an army was an unprecedented and potentially disastrous move. Before he would entrust her with the fate of France, Joan had to face another formidable challenge, a rigorous theological inquiry at Poitiers. For 3 weeks, Joan was subjected to intense scrutiny by a panel of France's most learned clerics, theologians, and legal scholars. These men, steeped in scholastic tradition and wary of heresy, questioned her relentlessly. They probed every aspect of her visions, her childhood, her faith, and her understanding of Catholic doctrine. They sought to determine if her voices came from God or from the devil, a critical distinction in an era where accusations of witchcraft could lead directly to the pyre. Despite her illiteracy and lack of formal education, Joan met their challenges with remarkable wit, wisdom, and an unwavering composure that astounded her examiners. When asked why she needed soldiers if God wished to save France, she famously replied, "The soldiers will fight, and God will grant the victory." When pressed on her visions, she stood firm, describing her experiences with a clarity and conviction that defied doubt. She answered sophisticated theological questions with simple, profound truths, often turning the arguments of her learned interrogators back on themselves. Her responses, though lacking in academic complexity, carried the weight of profound faith and unshakable belief. The Poitiers inquiry, designed to uncover falsehoods, instead revealed a woman of extraordinary spiritual fortitude and uncanny discernment. The clerics, initially skeptical, were ultimately left with no choice but to declare her visions orthodox and her character unimpeachable. Joan had passed her divine examination. She was deemed pure, pious, and, crucially, a messenger of God, paving the way for Charles to finally embrace her as the instrument of France's salvation. With her divine mandate validated by the Poitiers Inquiry, Joan was no longer merely a peasant girl with extraordinary claims. She was a consecrated messenger, a living symbol of God's will. Now, she prepared for war, but not as a conventional general. Her tools of battle would be as unique as her mission itself, infused with spiritual significance. Foremost among her requests was a distinctive banner. This was no ordinary battle standard. Joan described its precise design: a white field, emblazoned with an image of Christ in majesty, holding the world, flanked by two angels, and inscribed with the words Jesus Maria. This was her personal standard, a visual representation of her direct connection to the divine. It was not meant to glorify herself, but to proclaim God's direct involvement in the war. The banner would serve as a powerful beacon of hope and faith, a visible symbol to both friend and foe that the forces of heaven were now engaged. It would lead the charge, not for earthly glory, but for divine victory. Next, Joan required a suit of armor. But again, not just any armor. She requested a custom-made suit of white plate armor. This choice was deliberate and highly symbolic. White, the color of purity, light, and divine favor, would make her stand out on the battlefield, an ethereal figure among the grime and blood of war. It was a visual declaration of her spiritual purity and her role as a holy warrior, protected and guided by God. The armor, rumored to have been found in the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois after Joan indicated its location, was a testament to her miraculous insight and her sacred purpose. These were not mere accoutrements of war. The holy banner and the gleaming white armor were potent psychological weapons, imbued with spiritual power. They solidified Joan's unique position, distinguishing her from every other military commander of her age. She was not fighting for territory or dynastic ambition. She was fighting a holy war, and her very appearance, clad in divine symbols, would electrify the demoralized French troops and strike fear into the hearts of their English adversaries. For decades, the French army had known little but defeat. Their morale was shattered, their faith in their leadership, and indeed in God's favor, was profoundly shaken. They were a broken force, outmaneuvered and outfought by the English, their spirit eroded by endless sieges and lost battles. Commanders were cautious, soldiers despondent, and the common man saw little hope on the horizon. Then came Joan. Her arrival at the camp of the French forces, preparing for the relief of Orleans, was nothing short of a seismic event. She was a figure unlike any they had ever seen. A young woman, clad in brilliant white armor, bearing a sacred banner, speaking with an unshakable conviction that came not from tactical briefings, but from divine revelation. Her mere presence ignited a spark in the hearts of the weary soldiers. Her unwavering faith was infectious. She spoke to them not of complex strategies, but of God's will, of France's destiny, and of the sacred duty to reclaim their land. She instilled in them a belief that they were no longer fighting a losing battle, but a holy war destined for victory. She banned swearing, encouraged confession, and insisted on moral conduct, transforming the often unruly camps into places of renewed spiritual purpose. Miraculously, hope began to flicker, then to burn brightly. Soldiers who had been ready to desert now polished their weapons with renewed vigor. Cowardice gave way to courage, despair to determined resolve. They looked at Joan, the Maid, and saw not just a commander, but a living embodiment of God's promise. Her charisma was undeniable, her certainty absolute. She didn't just command, she inspired, she uplifted, she transformed. The demoralized, fractured remnants of France's army were beginning to coalesce into a cohesive, spiritually emboldened force, ready to follow their Maid into the impossible. They believed, truly believed, that with Joan leading them, God was finally on their side. As Joan prepared her revitalized troops, the grim reality of the war was starkly embodied in the city of Orleans. For 6 agonizing months, since October 1428, Orleans had endured a relentless siege by the English forces. It was not merely another city. It was the last major stronghold preventing English control of the vital Loire Valley and, with it, direct access to the very heartland of France. Its strategic importance could not be overstated. If Orleans fell, there would be little left to stop the English from marching unopposed to Bourges, Charles VII's provisional capital, effectively extinguishing any remaining French claims to sovereignty. The city was surrounded by a formidable ring of English fortifications, bastilles, and earthworks, making relief seem an impossible dream. The River Loire, a crucial artery for supplies and communication, was cut off by English bridges and strongpoints. Inside the city walls, the situation was desperate. Food supplies were dwindling, morale was plummeting, and the defenders, though brave, were exhausted and outnumbered. They had resisted valiantly, but the relentless bombardments, the constant threat of assault, and the sheer isolation had taken their toll. Disease and starvation were as potent enemies as the English archers and men-at-arms. Letters smuggled out painted a dire picture. Without immediate relief, Orleans was doomed. For the French, Orleans was more than a city. It was a symbol. Its continued defiance, however precarious, represented the flickering flame of French resistance. Its fall, however, would represent the complete and utter collapse, the final, crushing blow that would cement English domination and perhaps forever alter the map of Europe. The fate of a kingdom, a culture, a people, rested precariously on the crumbling walls and desperate courage of the defenders within Orleans. Against the backdrop of Orleans' imminent fall, Joan of Arc arrived, not with the cautious, conventional approach expected of military leaders, but with an audacity born of divine conviction. The established generals of Charles V's army, men like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, favored a slow, methodical approach, cutting English supply lines, attempting to starve the besiegers into submission, or a prolonged war of attrition. They saw the English fortifications as impregnable and direct assault as suicidal. But Joan's visions demanded a different path, a direct path, an act of faith. Her strategy was revolutionary in its simplicity and daring. She insisted on a direct and immediate relief of the city. Rather than engaging in the intricate maneuvers preferred by the seasoned commanders, she proposed bypassing the strongest English bastions, the formidable Les Tourelles, and other fortified positions that guarded the main roads. Her plan was to approach Orleans from the less guarded southern bank of the Loire, where English defenses were weaker, using boats to ferry her troops and supplies directly into the city. This was not merely a tactical decision. It was a psychological one. Joan understood that the morale of the defenders was paramount. A slow, conventional approach might prolong the agony. A swift, decisive blow, delivered with the element of surprise, would galvanize the French and shatter English confidence. She envisioned a morale-driven assault, convinced that God would grant victory to those who acted with faith and courage. Despite the skepticism of her more experienced counterparts, Joan's unwavering conviction, now backed by the Dauphin himself, prevailed. She rode at the head of her relief column, her white armor gleaming, her holy banner flying, a visible beacon of hope and divine purpose. Her leadership was a unique blend of spiritual guidance and practical decisiveness. She was leading them not just to a battle, but to a destiny. It was a strategy that flew in the face of centuries of military doctrine, but it was a strategy dictated by heaven, and it was about to change everything. The arrival of Joan of Arc in Orleans on April 29th, 1429, was nothing short of a miracle for the beleaguered French. But her divine mandate wasn't just to inspire, it was to act. Within days, the Maid transformed the static, demoralized siege into a whirlwind of audacious assaults. Her presence was a catalyst, breathing anew, almost frenzied ferocity into the French forces who, for so long, had known only retreat and despair. The English, accustomed to their methodical, grinding siege, were utterly unprepared for this sudden, aggressive shift. Joan's strategy was deceptively simple. Don't just defend, attack the enemy's strongholds. Her first target was the formidable English Bastille of St. Lou, situated to the east of the city. On May 4th, with Joan at the vanguard, carrying her sacred banner, French troops stormed St. Lou. Eyewitness accounts speak of a sudden, overwhelming surge of courage, as if Joan herself infused them with a divine strength. The English garrison, caught off guard and facing an enemy utterly transformed, quickly fell. The capture of St. Lou was a vital first step, opening supply lines, and more importantly, shattering the psychological grip of English invincibility. But this was merely a prelude. 2 days later, on May 6th, Joan turned her attention to the southern fortifications, specifically the Bastille d'Augustins. This strategic stronghold was essential for controlling access to the bridgehead. Again, the French attacked with an unprecedented zeal, fueled by the victories and Joan's unwavering conviction. As fierce fighting raged, the English at Augustins were cut off and overwhelmed. Its fall cleared the way for the most critical objective, Les Tourelles. This twin-towered fort, bristling with English archers and artillery, protected the strategic bridge across the Loire River. It was the linchpin of the English siege, the very symbol of their stranglehold on Orleans. On the morning of May 7th, Joan led the charge directly against Les Tourelles. It was a brutal, bloody assault. Accounts tell of Joan herself being wounded by an arrow to the shoulder, yet she famously pulled it out herself, refusing to retreat, her cries of encouragement echoing across the battlefield. The sight of their wounded Maid, still fighting, ignited an almost fanatical determination in the French. They scaled ladders, faced a hail of arrows and boiling oil, and after hours of ferocious combat, the French forces finally breached the English defenses. The English commander, William Glassdale, and his men were trapped on the burning bridge, many drowning in the Loire as they tried to escape. The capture of Les Tourelles was not just a victory. It was a thunderclap that signaled the beginning of the end for the siege of Orleans. The once impenetrable English cordon was now broken, irrevocably, by the will of a peasant girl. The fall of Les Tourelles was the death knell for the English siege of Orleans. With their key stronghold gone and their forces demoralized, the English commanders faced an impossible choice. Their troops, who had once held a firm grip on the city, were now surrounded, their supply lines precarious, and their morale utterly shattered by the sheer, inexplicable ferocity of the French and the terrifying legend of the Maid. They had witnessed their perceived invincibility crumble in a matter of days. Faced with these insurmountable odds, the English, under the command of John Talbot, gathered their remaining forces and, under the cover of darkness, began to withdraw. On the morning of May 8th, 1429, the citizens of Orleans awoke to an unbelievable sight. The English camps were deserted. The enemy, who had tormented them for months, was gone. The siege was lifted. The relief, the joy, the sheer euphoria that swept through the city was palpable. Bells rang out. People poured into the streets, tears of joy streaming down their faces. They had endured months of starvation, bombardment, and despair, only to be saved by a miracle. This was more than just a military victory. It was a profound psychological earthquake. For nearly a century, the English had projected an aura of military superiority, their longbowmen and disciplined armies cutting through French resistance with chilling efficiency. Orleans had been the linchpin of their ambition, a gateway to the south, and its capture seemed inevitable. But Joan of Arc had shattered that myth. She had demonstrated that the English could be beaten not just in skirmishes, but in decisive, pitched battles. The lifting of the siege of Orleans irrevocably shifted the momentum of the 100 Years' War. It wasn't merely a strategic success. It was a spiritual awakening for France. Hope, a commodity long scarce, now surged through the veins of a weary nation. French nationalism, flickering for decades under the shadow of foreign occupation, burst into a roaring flame. Joan, the Maid of Orleans, became a living emblem of this renewed spirit, a divine instrument sent to deliver France from its oppressors. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. The English were now plagued by doubt and fear, their confidence eroded, while the French, inspired by Joan, felt an unstoppable, righteous conviction. The war, once a slow, grinding defeat for France, had found its turning point. The path to a unified, free France, once unimaginable, now seemed divinely ordained. With the siege lifted from Orleans, Joan of Arc transitioned from a provincial curiosity to an international phenomenon. She was no longer just the Maid from Domremy. She was the Maid of Orleans, a moniker that resonated with miraculous victory and divine intervention. Her legend exploded across France with breathtaking speed, carried by word of mouth, by minstrels, by returning soldiers, and by the clergy. In an age starved for heroes, Joan was more than a hero. She was a living saint, a prophet, a physical manifestation of God's favor for France. The awe and reverence she inspired were profound. People flocked for miles around just to catch a glimpse of her, to touch her armor, or to hear her speak. They believed she possessed supernatural powers, that her presence alone could turn the tide of battle. Artists, even in the midst of war, began to depict her, though few contemporary images survive. The common folk, weary of endless conflict and suffering, saw in her their last, best hope, a pure, uncorrupted figure who spoke directly to God and fought for them. Even skeptical nobles and churchmen, who had initially dismissed her as a madwoman or a sorceress, now had to reckon with the undeniable evidence of her victories. Her story, embellished and amplified with each telling, became a powerful tool for galvanizing support for the Dauphin, Charles VII. For years, Charles had been a figure of ridicule, the King of Bourges, presiding over a fractured kingdom, his legitimacy questioned by the Treaty of Troyes and the English claim to the throne. But Joan's victories offered him a new narrative. He was not merely a claimant, but a divinely chosen king, destined for coronation, and Joan was God's messenger sent to ensure it. This rapid rise to fame had a transformative effect on the French populace. Where there was apathy and disunity, there was now a burgeoning sense of national identity, a shared purpose centered around the Maid and her mission to crown Charles at Reims. Villages and towns, previously hesitant to resist English or Burgundian authority, now found renewed courage. Recruitment soared as young men, inspired by Joan's example, flocked to her banner, convinced they were fighting for God and France. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl, had in a few short weeks become the undisputed spiritual and military heart of a nation reborn, her legend an unstoppable force that promised to sweep away decades of English dominion and forge a new future for France. The world would never be the same. The euphoria following Orleans could have easily led to complacency, a pause to bask in the glory. But Joan of Arc knew that momentum in warfare was a fleeting, precious commodity. She argued passionately that the French must strike while the English were still reeling, before they could regroup and reinforce. Her immediate focus, clearing the strategically vital Loire Valley of English garrisons, thereby securing the path for the Dauphin's coronation in Reims, the traditional city of kings. Despite initial hesitations from cautious royal counselors who favored negotiation over continued aggression, Joan's resolute will prevailed. She convinced Charles VII to launch a rapid, aggressive campaign. This swift Loire campaign, undertaken in June 1429, showcased not only Joan's inspiring leadership, but also her developing military prowess and keen strategic vision. She understood the importance of securing key river crossings and strongholds. Her first target was Jargeau, a heavily fortified town east of Orleans, commanded by the formidable English General William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. On June 12th, Joan led the French assault. The battle was fierce, with Joan once again at the forefront, personally placing a ladder against the walls. A stone projectile struck her helmet, knocking her to the ground, but she quickly rose, shouting, "Forward, friends! The Lord has condemned the English." Her indomitable spirit spurred the French to renewed effort, and Jargeau fell swiftly, its garrison either captured or killed, and Suffolk himself taken prisoner. The campaign continued with relentless pace. On June 15th, the French captured the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire, a crucial crossing point, then bypassed the main English garrison there to attack Beaugency. By June 17th, after a day of intense fighting, Beaugency surrendered. These lightning-fast victories demonstrated a remarkable coordination and effectiveness for French forces, largely attributed to Joan's strategic impetus and her ability to instill unwavering confidence in her commanders and troops. The Loire Valley, a vital artery of communication and supply, was systematically purged of English presence. The success of this campaign was pivotal. It not only liberated a significant swathe of French territory, but, crucially, secured the strategic route eastward, directly to Reims. Joan had, through sheer force of will and military genius, unlocked the path to her ultimate divine mandate, the coronation of the true King of France. The stage was set for the next, even more decisive, encounter that would irrevocably shatter English dominance. The momentum of the Loire campaign, ignited by Joan, was about to culminate in a clash that would irrevocably alter the course of the 100 Years' War. As the French cleared the Loire Valley, the English, desperate to reassert their authority, gathered a substantial field army under the experienced command of Sir John Fastolfe and John Talbot. Their objective was to intercept the French and prevent any further advances, especially towards Reims. On June 18, 1429, near the village of Patay, west of Orleans, the two armies met. What followed was not a drawn-out, grinding engagement, but a lightning-fast, utterly decisive French victory that would go down in history as the Battle of Patay. The English, adhering to their traditional tactics, were in the process of setting up their defensive positions, preparing their formidable archers behind a line of sharpened stakes, a maneuver that had brought them victory countless times before. But they made a crucial error. A deer startled near their vanguard, revealing their position prematurely. The French, under the tactical brilliance of commanders like La Hire and Jean Potin de Zaintrailles, and spurred by Joan's relentless drive for immediate action, seized the opportunity with breathtaking speed. Unlike previous engagements where French caution often allowed the English to fully deploy, this time, the French cavalry launched an immediate, devastating charge. Joan, though not directly leading the cavalry vanguard, was present on the field, her very presence inspiring and her strategic imperative for swift aggression paramount. The English were caught completely off guard, their archers still deploying stakes, unable to form their protective lines. The French heavy cavalry crashed into their unprepared ranks with brutal force. The renowned English longbowmen, usually the linchpin of their defense, were decimated before they could loose a single volley. The battle quickly devolved into a rout. Sir John Fastolfe, seeing the hopeless situation, fled the field with a portion of his men, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. John Talbot, ever valiant, fought fiercely but was eventually captured. The Battle of Patay was a crushing defeat for the English, a catastrophe. Thousands of English soldiers were killed or captured, effectively destroying their elite field army in France. More significantly, it shattered the myth of English invincibility in open battle. For decades, the English had dominated the battlefield with their superior tactics and archers. Patay demonstrated that with bold, swift action and under inspired leadership, the French could not only challenge but utterly dismantle English military supremacy. The psychological impact was immense, solidifying Joan's reputation as a divine warrior and propelling the French onward, unimpeded, towards Reims. The era of English dominance on the battlefield was decisively over. With the Loire Valley secured and the English field army decimated at Patay, Joan of Arc's divine mission pressed forward with renewed urgency. Her next, singular objective was clear: to march the Dauphin, Charles, to Reims, the hallowed city where French kings had been crowned for over 1,000 years. This was not merely a ceremonial journey. It was a profound act of legitimization, a declaration to all of France and Europe that Charles was the rightful, divinely sanctioned sovereign. The journey itself, beginning on June 29th, 1429, was nothing short of miraculous. The route to Reims lay through territories largely controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. Conventional military wisdom dictated that such a march would be fraught with danger, requiring sieges and pitched battles at every turn. Yet, Joan insisted on a direct, confident approach, believing her presence and God's will would overcome all obstacles. And so it proved, as the royal procession, led by Joan and her banner, approached town after town. Garrisons that had for years defied French authority now opened their gates without resistance. Troyes, a major Burgundian stronghold, initially held out, but after Joan's resolute presence and a brief, bloodless siege, it too surrendered on July 10th. Chalons and Champagne followed suit. The psychological warfare waged by Joan was immense. Her reputation as the Maid of Orleans, her unbroken string of victories, and the widely held belief in her divine mandate struck fear into the hearts of France's enemies. The Burgundians, already wary of English weakness after Patay, preferred to yield rather than face the wrath of God's chosen champion. This unresisted march was a testament to Joan's almost supernatural influence. Towns that had been under English or Burgundian rule for years, now, simply out of awe and apprehension, swore allegiance to Charles VII. The countryside, once hostile, now greeted the procession with celebration and relief. This wasn't a military conquest. It was a psychological triumph, a bloodless reclamation of territory and loyalty. By July 16th, 1429, the royal army, led by the Maid, arrived at the gates of Reims. The city, anticipating their arrival, opened its doors, its citizens welcoming their future king with joy. The procession into Reims was a symbolic spectacle, a triumphant march through what had once been enemy territory, now reclaimed by the sheer force of Joan's will and God's favor. The stage was set for the culmination of Joan's primary mission, a moment that would redefine the very soul of France. On July 17th, 1429, inside the magnificent Reims Cathedral, Joan of Arc stood beside Charles VII as he was anointed and crowned King of France. This was the culmination of her most crucial divine mandate, the very heart of her mission, to legitimize a dispossessed monarch and restore the rightful order to a fractured kingdom. The atmosphere inside the ancient cathedral was charged with profound historical and spiritual significance. For years, Charles had been mocked as the King of Bourges, his claim to the throne undermined by the Treaty of Troyes, which had disinherited him in favor of the English king. His legitimacy was constantly questioned, his authority challenged by both English occupation and Burgundian alliances. But the coronation in Reims, the sacred site where French kings had been crowned for centuries, irrevocably changed everything. It was a powerful public declaration that Charles was not merely a claimant, but a divinely chosen sovereign, his rule sanctioned by God himself. Joan, standing near the altar, her banner held high, was a powerful visual testament to this divine sanction. Her presence, the Maid of Orleans, the uneducated peasant girl who had led France to miraculous victories, confirmed the heavens' favor upon Charles. Her very being symbolized God's direct intervention in French affairs. This ceremony was meticulously designed to strip away any lingering doubts about Charles's right to rule, reinforcing his sovereignty with ancient rituals and the potent symbolism of God's blessing. The impact of this coronation was immediate and far-reaching. Across France, news spread like wildfire that a true king, a legitimate, divinely sanctioned monarch, now sat on the throne. This moment solidified Charles VII's authority, galvanized national unity, and inspired a deeper loyalty among his subjects. It provided a powerful counter-narrative to English propaganda and the claims of Henry VI. The coronation was a psychological victory on par with Orleans and Patay, uniting France under a single, recognized head. For Joan, it was the fulfillment of her primary mission. Her voices had commanded her to bring Charles to Reims for his coronation, and now it was done. A weary France, suffering for decades under war and internal strife, finally had a king, anointed by God and affirmed by the extraordinary deeds of his messenger. The future of France, once bleak and uncertain, now shone with the promise of a renewed, unified nation under the legitimate rule of Charles VII, all thanks to the unwavering faith and courage of a peasant girl. With Charles VII crowned in Reims, Joan of Arc believed her divine mission, though its primary objective fulfilled, was far from complete. Her voices, she insisted, now commanded the most audacious step, an immediate assault on English-held Paris. The capital city, strategically vital and symbolically crucial, remained under foreign control, a festering wound on the body of France. For Joan, striking while the iron was hot, capitalizing on the momentum of Reims and the shattered English morale, was paramount. Delay, she felt, would only allow the enemy to regroup. However, Joan's fervent drive for direct action met with a cautious, often frustrating political reality. Charles VII, now officially king, found himself pulled in multiple directions. His newly won legitimacy had to be solidified, alliances built, and the careful diplomacy of his court often prioritized over Joan's aggressive military strategy. Figures like Georges de la Tremoille, Charles's chief advisor, advocated for negotiation with the Duke of Burgundy, believing a political settlement was preferable to another costly siege, especially against a city as formidable as Paris. The royal council's indecision created agonizing delays. Joan, restless and impatient, watched as the precious window of opportunity began to close. Finally, in late August, after weeks of political maneuvering and half-hearted preparations, a French force, with Joan at its head, reluctantly advanced towards Paris. The siege began on September 8, 1429. It was to be a costly and ultimately unsuccessful endeavor. Joan, true to form, was at the forefront of the assault on the Porte Saint-Honoré, the main gate. She tirelessly rallied her troops, despite being wounded in the thigh by a crossbow bolt. Her determination was unwavering, but the French forces lacked the full commitment and resources necessary for such a massive undertaking. The assault was disorganized, the artillery inadequate, and critical reinforcements failed to arrive as promised. The English and Burgundian defenders, fighting fiercely for the capital, repelled every attack. After a day of brutal fighting and heavy casualties, Charles VII, without consulting Joan, ordered a retreat. The failure to capture Paris was a significant setback, not just militarily, but for Joan's morale. It highlighted a growing chasm between her direct, divinely inspired approach and the more cautious, politically motivated strategies of the royal court. For the first time since Orleans, Joan had encountered a wall she could not breach, not by force of arms, but by the insidious power of political intrigue and royal indecision. The push for Paris marked a turning point, not in the war, but in Joan's own destiny, signaling the beginning of her waning influence within the court and foreshadowing the challenges that lay ahead. The euphoria of Orleans, the miracle of Reims, the coronation of Charles VII, these moments represented the apex of Joan of Arc's influence. Yet, as the Maid's star ascended, the shadows within the French court began to lengthen, concealing the insidious tendrils of jealousy and resentment. Joan's unprecedented rise, her direct access to the king, and her unconventional, divinely inspired strategies were anathema to the established order. Old guard generals, accustomed to protracted sieges and cautious maneuvers, bristled at her audacious frontal assaults and her utter disregard for military convention. Courtiers, who had spent decades vying for Charles's ear, found themselves sidelined by a peasant girl who claimed direct counsel from God. The most prominent figure orchestrating this subtle yet destructive campaign against Joan was likely Georges de la Tremoille, the king's powerful and deeply conservative Grand Chamberlain. La Tremoille, wary of Joan's power and perhaps fearful of her moral authority challenging his own influence, saw her as a threat to be neutralized. He, and others like him, campaigned against her, questioning the provenance of her visions, subtly suggesting that her continued presence risked offending both God and man. How could a king truly rule if guided by an illiterate girl who heard voices? The very divine favor that had brought her success was now twisted into a vulnerability, a source of suspicion. Charles VII, forever indecisive and easily swayed, began to withdraw his full support. The momentum Joan had painstakingly built faltered after the failed assault on Paris in September 1429, a setback many at court. Eagerly attributed to her supposed overreach, despite her own insistence that she lacked sufficient royal backing. Funds became scarce, troop deployments were withheld, and her strategic advice increasingly ignored. The court, once electrified by her presence, now seemed determined to reassert its cautious, bureaucratic grip. Joan, who had embodied France's hope, was slowly being isolated, her warnings about continued English and Burgundian threats falling on deaf ears. The political landscape of France, once galvanized by her divine mission, was becoming a treacherous labyrinth, and Joan, the unyielding warrior, found herself increasingly vulnerable, not on the battlefield, but within the gilded cages of her own king's court. With the political winds at court turning against her, Joan found herself increasingly marginalized, her fervent pleas for renewed campaigns falling on deaf ears. Yet, her divine conviction remained unshaken. Despite the king's waning support and the treachery of his advisors, Joan refused to abandon the struggling towns and loyal subjects of France. Her mission, she believed, was far from complete. In May 1430, a critical threat emerged. The strategic town of Compiègne, a vital stronghold on the Oise River, was besieged by a formidable coalition of English and Burgundian forces. Its fall would open the path to Paris for the enemy, further cementing their control over northern France. Defying implicit royal orders to remain inactive, Joan, driven by her unyielding spirit and her voices, rallied a small, dedicated force. These were the loyal few who still believed in her, who had witnessed her miracles and fought alongside her. On May 23, 1430, she rode into Compiègne, a beacon of hope for its desperate defenders. The town was already encircled, its fate seemingly sealed. Joan, ever the strategist and warrior, understood that a direct confrontation was suicide. Instead, she planned a daring sortie, a lightning attack aimed at the Burgundian encampment at Margny, hoping to disrupt their siege lines and perhaps even capture their leader. At dawn, under the cover of a dense fog, Joan led her mounted troops out of Compiègne. It was a desperate gamble, a calculated risk born of necessity. She rode at the head of her company, her banner flying, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. The attack was initially successful, catching the Burgundians off guard. But the enemy forces were vast, and reinforcements quickly arrived, including English archers. The French, outnumbered, were forced to retreat back towards the town. Joan, always ensuring her soldiers' safety first, bravely covered their withdrawal. Her courage was legendary. She placed herself in the most dangerous positions, urging her men forward, a shield against the pursuing enemy. This was not a retreat of cowardice, but a valiant fighting withdrawal, her final act of battlefield leadership. As the French forces, led by Joan, desperately fought their way back towards the safety of Compiègne's gates, the chaos of battle reached its peak. Joan, ever the last to retreat, found herself isolated, a solitary figure amidst a swirling maelstrom of steel and desperate men. Her focus was on ensuring her soldiers reached the city walls, her own safety secondary. But fate, and the treachery of war, had other plans. In the frantic melee, a moment of profound vulnerability struck. Accounts vary, but it's believed that as she reached the outer defenses, either the drawbridge was prematurely raised, or she was cut off from the main body of her men. Suddenly, she was surrounded. Burgundian soldiers, eager for a prize, closed in. One, A Picard archer named Archambaud de Franquet is often credited with pulling her from her horse. The moment was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. The Maid of Orleans, the savior of France, tumbled to the ground, her armor clanking, her legendary banner perhaps falling alongside her. She struggled, fighting even as she was dismounted, but the numbers were too great. Overwhelmed, Joan was captured. The shock rippled through both sides. For the French, it was a moment of profound despair, a chilling blow to their morale. Their divine champion, their Pucelle, was gone, snatched away. For the Burgundians and English, the realization dawned with a surge of triumphant disbelief. They had captured the witch, the heretic, the very symbol of French resistance. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was Joan of Arc. Her captors, under the command of Jean de Luxembourg, a powerful Burgundian nobleman, knew immediately the immense value of their prize. The news spread like wildfire, a seismic event reverberating across the battlefields and courts of warring France. The Maid, who had seemed invincible, was now a captive, her future uncertain, her fate hanging by a thread. Joan of Arc's capture was not just a military victory. It was a political earthquake, and her Burgundian captors, led by Jean de Luxembourg, understood its immense strategic and financial value. They held in their custody the woman who had single-handedly galvanized French resistance, crowned Charles VII, and shattered English morale. For the English, Joan was not merely an enemy commander. She was a dangerous symbol, a witch who had used dark magic to defy them. Her existence undermined their claims to the French throne, and her continued survival, even as a prisoner, posed a constant threat. Thus began the insidious negotiations for Joan's transfer. The English, desperate to silence her and break the spirit of France, were willing to pay a king's ransom. Months passed as Joan was held in various Burgundian castles, Beaurevoir, her fate debated and haggled over. She was a pawn in a high-stakes game of diplomacy and greed. Jean de Luxembourg, despite his initial reluctance to hand over such a valuable prisoner, was ultimately swayed by the colossal sum offered by the English, 10,000 livres tournois. This was an astronomical amount, equivalent to the ransom of a king or the cost of a small army. For the Burgundians, the financial reward was too great to refuse, and it also served to solidify their alliance with England against their traditional French rivals. In November 1430, the deal was struck. Joan, now stripped of her armor and subjected to constant psychological pressure, was formally handed over to the English. Her journey to Rouen, the de facto capital of English-occupied Normandy, was a brutal one. Shackled and under heavy guard, she was paraded through hostile territory, an object of derision for some, and silent sorrow for others. The English had their prize. They didn't just want her defeated. They wanted her utterly discredited, her divine mission exposed as a diabolical lie. For them, Joan's capture was not merely about securing a prisoner, but about destroying a myth, a symbol of hope that continued to burn brightly even in captivity. Her sale marked the definitive turn in her tragic story, sealing her fate in the hands of those who would stop at nothing to condemn her. With Joan of Arc firmly in English custody, the next step in their plan to neutralize her was a meticulously orchestrated trial designed to discredit her entirely. Central to this sinister endeavor was Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was no ordinary churchman. He was a man driven by ambition, a fervent English sympathizer who had been stripped of his see by Charles VII for his loyalty to the Anglo-Burgundian cause. His appointment as the leading inquisitor and primary prosecutor in Joan's trial was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate choice, guaranteeing a predetermined outcome. Cauchon saw in Joan's trial an opportunity for both revenge against the French monarchy and advancement within the English-controlled ecclesiastical hierarchy. He was a formidable opponent, intelligent, politically astute, and utterly ruthless. He painstakingly assembled an ecclesiastical court in Rouen, comprising more than 100 clerics, theologians, doctors of law, and canons from the University of Paris and other institutions. However, this assembly was far from impartial. Many were handpicked by Cauchon himself, pressured by English authorities, or owed their positions to English patronage. They were predominantly pro-English, operating under the shadow of the English occupation, making any semblance of impartiality impossible. Cauchon understood that a simple execution would only make Joan a martyr. To truly crush her, her divine claims had to be disproven, her voices exposed as demonic, and her actions condemned as heresy. This would invalidate Charles VII's coronation, delegitimize his reign, and reaffirm the English claim to the French throne. The trial was therefore not just a legal proceeding, but a propaganda tool, a theological weapon. From the moment Joan entered the courtroom, her fate was sealed. Bishop Cauchon, with his cold intellect and unwavering loyalty to the English, stood ready to conduct a judicial assassination, cloaked in the robes of religious piety. The trial of Joan of Arc was a masterclass in judicial manipulation, designed not to uncover truth, but to construct guilt. The charges against her were meticulously crafted, transforming her extraordinary deeds into grave religious offenses. The primary accusation was heresy, the gravest crime a person could commit in the medieval world. Her claim of direct communication with God through her voices, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, was twisted. The court argued that if these voices were not from God, they must be from the devil, thus labeling her a sorceress, a witch, and a tool of evil. Another crucial charge was idolatry, stemming from her veneration of her visions. This further solidified the perception of her as religiously misguided. Then there was the infamous charge of cross-dressing. For a woman to wear male attire was, in the eyes of the Church, an abomination, an act of defiance against divine and natural order, as interpreted through Deuteronomy. Joan had adopted male clothing and armor from the outset of her mission, claiming it was for practical purposes, protection in battle, and safety from sexual assault while living among soldiers. To her accusers, however, it was proof of her scandalous nature, a rejection of her womanhood, and a sign of her allegiance to the devil. Beyond these, she was accused of blasphemy for claiming to be sent by God and refusing to submit to the church militant, the earthly church. She was charged with schism for supposedly rejecting the authority of the English-backed Pope and supporting the French king. Every aspect of her unique life, every unconventional action, was scrutinized and weaponized. The court, led by Bishop Cauchon, painstakingly compiled 70 articles of accusation, later consolidated into 12, each designed to paint Joan as a dangerous heretic worthy of death. Her profound faith, her unwavering conviction, and her extraordinary courage were systematically reinterpreted as arrogance, rebellion, and diabolical influence, constructing an ironclad case for her condemnation. Against this overwhelming tide of manufactured charges, orchestrated by brilliant legal minds and powerful political forces, stood Joan of Arc, a young, illiterate peasant girl, alone, without counsel, facing over 100 of the most learned men in France. It was a confrontation seemingly designed for her utter defeat. Yet, to the astonishment and frustration of her inquisitors, Joan defended herself with a clarity, wit, and spiritual conviction that transcended her humble origins. Her responses, recorded meticulously by the court scribes, reveal a remarkable intellect and an unwavering spirit. When pressed to submit to the authority of the church militant, she famously declared, "I refer myself to God, my Creator, to whom I trust for all that I do." When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap designed to force her into either blasphemy or self-condemnation, she retorted, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." Such answers, filled with profound theological insight and spiritual humility, left her accusers stunned and unable to corner her. She steadfastly refused to deny her voices, asserting their divine origin with absolute certainty. Her mission, she maintained, was given directly by God, and she would not betray that sacred trust. Her determination was so profound that even her jailers and some of the judges were reportedly moved by her sincerity. She held her ground, day after day, against relentless interrogation, intimidation, and psychological torment. Her defense was not one of legal argument, but of truth, faith, and unwavering adherence to her spiritual experience. In that courtroom, surrounded by enemies and devoid of allies, Joan of Arc became a beacon of individual integrity, her voice a testament to the unshakable power of personal conviction against the might of institutional injustice. Despite Joan's eloquent and divinely inspired defense, the outcome of her trial was never in question. From its very inception, this was a political show trial, a judicial assassination masquerading as a search for truth. Every aspect of the proceedings was rigged, every right denied, ensuring her condemnation. She was never afforded legal counsel, a fundamental right even in medieval courts for those facing grave charges. Her requests for advocates were ignored, leaving her, an uneducated peasant, to face a panel of over 100 highly learned legal and theological experts alone. Defense witnesses crucial for any fair trial were systematically blocked. Those who might have spoken in her favor, her family, her loyal soldiers, those who had witnessed her miracles, were either intimidated, prevented from traveling, or simply never called. The court deliberately ignored compelling evidence that contradicted their narrative, preferring to rely on coerced testimonies and twisted interpretations. The transcripts themselves, meticulously recorded by the scribes, were likely manipulated, edited to emphasize incriminating statements and downplay Joan's brilliant counterarguments or appeals to God. The prison conditions further exemplify the injustice. She was held in a secular prison, guarded by rough English soldiers, rather than an ecclesiastical one, a deliberate move to expose her to the risk of sexual assault. This made her continued wearing of male attire a point of contention and a charge against her, a matter of practical self-preservation, which the court chose to ignore. The entire process was a cynical exercise in power, designed to deliver a verdict that served English political interests rather than divine or human justice. Joan of Arc was not on trial for heresy. She was on trial for daring to defeat England. Her condemnation was a foregone conclusion, a tragic chapter in a meticulously crafted narrative of injustice, leading her inevitably towards the ultimate sacrifice. For months, Joan had endured relentless interrogation, a grueling mental and spiritual war waged by some of the keenest legal and theological minds of the age. But even the Maid, fortified by her faith, had a breaking point. On May 24th, 1431, facing the horrifying spectacle of a public pyre erected in the cemetery of St. Ouen, the terror became too real. The judges, led by the ruthless Bishop Pierre Cauchon, presented her with an abjuration document, a confession of error, a renunciation of her visions and her heretical ways, including her male attire. The alternative was immediate, agonizing death by fire. Under immense psychological duress, cornered and exhausted, Joan made a choice that would haunt her and puzzle historians for centuries. She recanted. Her hand, perhaps guided, perhaps trembling, made a small cross on the parchment. It was a fleeting moment of human weakness, an instinct for self-preservation in the face of absolute horror. The crowd, witnessing the drama, erupted in varied reactions: relief, disappointment, confusion. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, but the terms were clear: she was to resume female dress. Yet, the prison walls of Rouen were no sanctuary. Within days, Joan was once again discovered in male attire. The reasons for this relapse are debated. Was it to protect herself from the male guards, a practical choice in the harsh prison conditions, or a profound reassertion of her identity and divine mission? For her judges, the answer was irrelevant. To them, it was a deliberate rejection of her abjuration, a clear sign of unrepentant heresy. By reclaiming her man's clothes, she had effectively revoked her recantation. This act provided Cauchon and his tribunal with the final, damning evidence they needed. They had trapped her in an inescapable theological paradox. If she wore men's clothes, she was a relapsed heretic. If she wore women's clothes, she potentially exposed herself to further abuse, a fate arguably worse than death for the Maid of God. The stage was now set, not for a reprieve, but for her tragic, inevitable end. Her brief moment of doubt had passed, replaced by an unwavering resolve, even in the shadow of the stake. The morning of May 30th, 1431, dawned bleak and gray over Rouen. The city's marketplace was a grim tableau, packed with thousands of spectators, English soldiers, and clergy. At its center stood a towering scaffold, topped with a pyre of faggots. This was to be the stage for the final act of Joan of Arc, the Maid of God, now condemned as a relapsed heretic. Joan was led to the stake, dressed in a simple white shift, her head shaved. She was surprisingly calm, her face reflecting a serene acceptance of her fate. As the executioner bound her, she asked for a crucifix. An English soldier, perhaps moved by her plight, fashioned a small wooden cross from a broken stick and handed it to her. Another priest, Brother Martin Ladvenu, held a large processional cross before her, which she gazed upon until the very end, her lips moving in prayer. Her cries were not of fear for herself, but of profound religious devotion. She invoked the names of Jesus and her saints, reaffirming the faith that had guided her since childhood. As the flames licked upwards, consuming the straw and wood, Joan's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, crying, "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" Her unwavering composure in the face of such a horrific death astonished many present. Accounts tell of English soldiers, and even some of her captors being visibly moved, some openly weeping, others expressing fear that they had just witnessed the burning of a saint. Bishop Cauchon himself reportedly shed tears, perhaps a moment of dawning realization regarding the magnitude of the injustice he had orchestrated. The very air around the pyre, thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood, was charged with a terrible, sacred awe. In that Rouen marketplace, Joan's physical life ended, but her spiritual journey transcended the flames, transforming a condemned heretic into an immortal martyr. Her final moments, rather than crushing her spirit, ignited a legend that would burn brighter than any pyre. The English and their Burgundian allies were not content with merely executing Joan. They feared her, even in death. Superstition was rife, and the potential for relics, fragments of her bones or clothing, to become objects of veneration for the French people was a real and present danger. To prevent any such possibility, her enemies took extreme measures to ensure that no trace of her physical presence would remain. After the flames had consumed her body, the executioner was ordered to rake through the ashes, ensuring everything was thoroughly incinerated, leaving nothing but fine dust. Her heart, reportedly still intact amidst the cinders, was also cast into the fire, a desperate, final attempt to deny any sacred remnant. Once the burning was complete, the ashes were gathered meticulously and transported to the nearby Seine River. There, under the watchful eyes of English soldiers, the last vestiges of Joan of Arc were scattered into the flowing waters. The river, a silent witness to centuries of French history, carried her remnants away, dispersing them, seemingly erasing her from the physical world. It was an act of profound desecration, a calculated move to stifle any burgeoning cult of personality, to bury her memory beneath the currents and the weight of their victory. Yet, in their zealous attempt to obliterate her, her enemies inadvertently achieved the opposite. By scattering her ashes to the wind and water, they ensured that her spirit became boundless, her legacy untraceable but pervasive. There was no single grave to visit, no monument to defile. Instead, Joan became an ubiquitous presence, her story whispered across France, carried by the very elements that sought to erase her. The injustice of her death, amplified by this final act of erasure, only cemented her legend, transforming her from a flesh-and-blood woman into an indomitable symbol of French resistance and divine purpose. The Seine, far from being her tomb, became the conduit through which her legend began its eternal journey. The English believed they had extinguished Joan of Arc, but her flame was merely hidden, awaiting the right moment to blaze anew. 25 years after her execution, France was a changed nation. The 100 Years' War was finally drawing to a close, with the French largely victorious, thanks in no small part to the impetus Joan had provided. King Charles VII, the man she had crowned, now sought to clear his own name and legitimize his reign by overturning the wrongful condemnation of his greatest champion. In 1455, he ordered a retrial. This rehabilitation trial was a meticulous and exhaustive undertaking. Over a period of several months, more than 100 witnesses were called, including former companions in arms, villagers from Domremy, and even some of the clerics who had served on the original tribunal. They testified to Joan's piety, her moral character, her unwavering faith, and the manifest good she had brought to France. The judges presiding over this new ecclesiastical court meticulously reviewed the original trial transcripts, exposing the myriad procedural irregularities, the political motivations, and the blatant violations of canon law. The verdict, delivered in Rouen on July 7, 1456, was unequivocal. Joan of Arc was declared innocent. Her original trial was annulled, her condemnation nullified, and her name cleared of all charges of heresy. From a condemned heretic, she was posthumously recognized as a martyr and a national heroine. Her rehabilitation was a powerful affirmation of French identity and a condemnation of English tyranny. Centuries later, her legend continued to grow, intertwining with the very fabric of French patriotism and Catholic faith. In 1909, the Catholic Church beatified her, and just 11 years later, on May 16, 1920, Joan of Arc was formally canonized as a saint. The peasant girl from Domremy, once burned at the stake, now stood among the revered figures of the Church, a testament to her enduring spirit and the profound impact of her divine mission. Saint Joan, the Maid of Orleans, became not just a symbol of France, but a universal icon of courage, faith, and the fight for justice, her name irrevocably etched into the annals of history and the hearts of millions. From the quiet fields of Domremy to the roaring battlefields of Orleans, and finally, to the tragic pyre in Rouen, we have witnessed the extraordinary journey of Joan of Arc, a testament to the power of a single individual, driven by unwavering faith and an unyielding will to change the course of history. Her humble peasant origins gave way to a pivotal role in securing the coronation of Charles VII, forever altering the destiny of France and bringing the long, devastating 100 Years' War to its eventual conclusion. Joan of Arc's story transcends time, emerging as a beacon of courage, a testament to conviction, an enduring symbol of national identity, not just for France, but for all who dare to dream beyond their circumstances. Her belief in her divine visions and the profound belief she inspired in a desperate, demoralized nation remind us of the immense power of the human spirit. Her voice, silenced too soon, echoes through centuries, inspiring countless individuals to find strength in conviction and fight for what they believe is right. The Maid of Orleans, the patron saint of France, a teenage girl whose extraordinary courage and unyielding spirit forged a nation and forever altered the course of history.